Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table. We discuss issues of God and culture. I'm Darrell, Bock, Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. And my guest today is Ron Nelson, who runs a ministry called Seeds of Joy with his wife, Star. And he just has a wonderful personal story, and the ministry is a wonderful ministry, so we thought we would talk to him about it. And in the midst of sharing before we recorded here, Ron started his story back at Florida State. So we'll start there, even though we're in Texas. We'll start there and let you roll. So you were in school at Florida State, and you were a sprinter. Is that right?
That is indeed right. First of all, thank you for the invitation here.
Pleasure. So 100-yard dash, 200, 400, what?
All three.
All three.
100, 200, and the 400, of course.
Okay.
Started at age 16, almost tied the world record as a 16-year-old. That's way back in the day.
Yeah, you're not that fast now, huh?
Oh, no. I'm running for Jesus, man.
That's great. So you graduated from Florida State, and then what happened next?
Well, I graduated from Florida State. Of course, I ran track there at Florida State and went on and got married. My wife and I have been married now for 38 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And went on down to Miami, and from there got involved in law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And from law enforcement, from Miami back to Tallahassee, still competing athletically-wise, but spent most of my time in Tallahassee in my younger days as a Tallahassee police officer.
And man, I could ask you questions about that, but I'll pass. We'll pass through that phase. And so, where did you go from Tallahassee as a police officer? What was next?
Well, as a police officer, I had several assignments. One in particular was a DARE officer, drug abuse resistance education. Loved it immensely, but the department wanted to make a change, and they wanted to put me back on what was called a power squad, and that was working from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. in the morning. I wouldn't do that. It was a job I did well, but it really, in terms of working with family, wasn't that good. So I wanted to make a change. And my pastor there in Tallahassee, Florida, invited me to come on staff there. So he gave me a...
Well, let me go back to the police thing. So was a power squad, was that like a SWAT team? Or
It was a squad. Primarily, it was the time that we were to work, from 6 p.m. to that 4 a.m.
So while everyone else is tired, they're calling you power, huh?
Yes, and that was the heat of the night, if you will. Things were happening at that time.
Right,
and
sure.
So we were that squad was
on call,
dedicated to do that work, doing those hours.
Oh wow! So you said, and my understanding is your wife was an encourager in this regard. Said no.
My wife did not really particularly like what I was doing because remember, in Florida State I was a sprinter.
Yeah.
So I would love for people to run away from me, and I would chase people down, and there wasn't too many times. There were a number of times that she would receive a call from the police department and said, "Ron, he's at the hospital. He's okay." But so I got in one of those foot pursuit situations a number of times, and then she said, "If you're gonna do that type of work, I prefer you not wear a uniform." And she was with the post office at that time, and that's the first time I heard about becoming a United States Postal Inspector. And so I left as a police officer, and eventually a year later or so, after 8 years, took a position as a United States Postal Inspector.
Oh, wow. And so I don't even know what postal inspectors do. What do they do?
United States Postal Inspectors are similar to the FBI. There are 200 laws on the books, federal laws governing the United States mail. And there are probably about, when I was a part of the service, about 1,600 U.S. postal inspectors in the country. They kind of like to take a back seat in terms of not much publicity.
So can you tell me what you did, or
yes.
I just want to make sure my life is in my hands.
Well, my specialty, I was put in Little Rock, Arkansas, and my assignment was identity theft, robbery, assaults, and burglaries with the United States Post Office.
Interesting, huh? So I've been a victim of identity theft, so I appreciate the work that you were doing. Okay, so you're a postal inspector, just minding your own business, right?
Postal inspector, minding my own business, working in Little Rock, Arkansas, at the same time heavily involved in my church in Little Rock.
Okay, so you were involved with your pastor, and so explain that transition, because you had a taste of ministry in the midst of being a postal inspector. Talk about that change.
Well, back in Florida, when I was transitioning from being with the police department and eventually taking the position as an inspector, there was an interim there where I thought I was not going to be involved in law enforcement. And what particularly took place, since I did not become, I went back to that power squad. Things weren't going good there, and I shared this information with the deacons of my church at that time. They prayed, laid hands on me, and my pastor at that time was out of town, and he eventually, a week later, called me in his office and said, if you're willing to leave the department, I want you to become on staff.
You know, all churches have an internet where information gets to the pastor.
They do indeed. I didn't know he was really informed as to what took place on a Wednesday night, because he was not in town at that particular time. And so I sat down with him. He said, come on staff. So I left the police department at that time and became what is called a minister of the liaison. I was a liaison between the pastor and about 46 ministries. The director of ministries was my title. Didn't have any, qualifications, and didn't go to seminary or anything, but I accepted the position. So God whet my appetite with ministry at that time.
So you worked there for a while, and then my understanding is you made a transit. Well, you'd been attending conferences that Tony Evans had been hosting.
Oh yes. I eventually accepted the position as an inspector. They put me in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the church in Arkansas was sending its volunteers and its leaders to Dr. Tony Evans' conferences here in Dallas, Texas, and they were doing that for several years. And I was, every year I would come to those conferences to learn and to grow. And one particular year, 2006, 2007, I came to that conference and I heard God speak to me and said, take your resume. That was the second time God had spoken to me. Previously in Florida, God said in a room with leaders, he said, who would go for me? And I said, I mumbled under my breath, here I am, Lord, send me, not knowing what the future was going to be like. Yeah.
So you submitted a resume to Tony. Tony's a good friend, and Pastor Evans. I'll treat him with respect.
Yes.
And what happened? What happened next?
Well, I took that resume to the conference, gave it to then the outreach pastor, and that resume wound up on the desk of Dr. Evans. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from his secretary, because I went online and found out that at that particular time, they had a position open for director of missions. And I had gotten so involved in missions at my church in Little Rock, and missions became a part of my DNA. And I just wanted to do something with regards to missions, and I wanted to be back on church staff because God had whet my appetite earlier in 1995. And so he invited me and my wife, because I asked him could I bring my wife for an interview to talk about this position's missions director. And I came down to Dallas from Arkansas. We had about an hour conversation, hour or so, and I accepted a position, not that position, but I accepted a position.
Now, so he had you do what first? In other words,
Well, it was interesting. My background, of course, I said a police officer, and in Florida, I was a DARE officer, drug abuse resistance education officer, for a number of years there, where I would work in the school system. I had about 15 schools that I worked with, kindergarten on up to high school, 12th grade, and talking about staying off drugs and that sort of thing. So I had some experience working in the school system and working with kids. Dr. Evans has a program called where he will send volunteers into the school system to mentor.
That's right.
And he had a position also open as the director of public school outreach. And it was that position that he offered to me, and I accepted.
Now, what led you? We haven't talked about this. What led you into having so much a desire to serve the community? Because most of what you're doing represents really significant community service.
Well, I love working with people. I love working with people, and even as a police officer, of course, that's a community position. You're engaging with people all the time, and I just have this nature about me about helping people. I don't know where it comes from, but I do have this, some people, a servant heart. So I have that heart in me.
So, okay, so you're working in the public schools, again, just minding your own business, doing your job, right?
Right.
And another change comes. What's next? What's next in your resume?
Well, like I said, once I got to Little Rock and working in the as a U.S. Postal Inspector, and then working very heavily in the church as a volunteer, I did community outreach. I worked in the prisons, went into the prisons, did a number of things. My wife and I led small group studies for married couples, a variety of things. And so I started feeling this calling, if you will, of God just drawing me closer to Him. And that it really just took over my entire being, to the point where I've been recall on one Wednesday, noonday service, I'm sitting listening to the preacher preach, and it was during my lunch hour from as an inspector, and tears started flowing. Just I could not move. And the pastor came up to me and he looked at me and he had that look, and I said, I don't know what's wrong. I'm just crying. He said, I know what's wrong. And I said, no. I'm not called to be a preacher. He said, Ron, not every preacher's meant to stand in a pulpit on Sunday mornings. And then that's when he asked me a few days later to start a missions initiative. I hesitate to say program. I don't like the word program. But to start a program, missions, at this church that was not doing missions. And people ask, Ron, how did you get involved in missions today and feel so strongly about it? One word: obedience. That's the word.
So this was earlier. This was before you came to Tony's church, right?
Before I came to church.
So you had you said you whet your appetite with ministry, but you also whet your appetite with missions. And then so years later you're in the public school, serving Oak Cliff through this initiative in the public schools, and there's another transition. What transition was that?
Well, when I finally did get to Oak Cliff, and I really thank Pastor Evans for bringing me on board, learned so much under his leadership. For 6 months, I did that. I was in the role of director of public school outreach because of my previous background as a police officer. And so I did that for 6 months. Things were going okay. I recall one volunteer looked at me and she said, Ron, you look like a fish out of water. And I knew what she was talking about, but then things got to Dr. Evans, and he and I went to lunch. And over lunch, he asked me a question about, tell me about your trips to Kenya, to South Africa, to Haiti. And I began to expound on all those trips and so forth. And he, in the middle of a bite of a hamburger, he said, you light up when you talk about missions. And indeed, I did. And we had our lunch, went back to our office. This was on a Friday. And on Monday morning, I got a call from Dr. Evans. And he said, you are no longer the director of public school outreach. You're now the director of missions. And that was the transition. So for 5 years, That's what I did at Oak Cliff Bible
So
Fellowship.
you were working with missions there, and of course, a very active church and significant church in the city. And but I think your story is I'm not done. There's something else coming. So what came after being director of missions at Oak Cliff?
Let me back up just briefly.
Okay.
When I left and stepped down from being a United States Postal Inspector, because my wife and I were taking these teams to various locations, Kenya being one of them. And in 2006, came home from taking a team to Kenya, short-term mission trip to Kenya. And it was November of 2006, and I heard God speak to me in my spirit, said, walk away from your job. And I was doing extremely well there. My wife was a postmaster, making a very good salary. And he said, walk away. And told my wife that evening, we prayed, we cried a little bit. And the next day, I went and resigned. And
this was a good job. I mean, and so you were, it was risky.
Yes, it was one of those things that doesn't make sense. Did not make sense at all. Didn't have any idea what I was going to do. And my wife and I said, well, let's just start a ministry. And we started a ministry called Sowing Seeds of Joy out of Psalms 126. And we went through the process of getting a nonprofit, and it took off from there. But it was also at the same time, I had this hunger to be on church staff. And at the same time we launched Sowing Seeds of Joy, I also looked at coming on board with Dr. Tony Evans.
I see. So you were doing two things at once, basically.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we know what ministry in the church is like and what it's like to run a missions program. But let's transition now to Seeds of Joy. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
So what year was this that we launched?
This was 2006, 2007.
Okay. So you're in multiple transitions in 2006 and 2007,
Yes,
if I'm hearing it right.
Yes.
So you've moved from Arkansas to Dallas, and you started off in the public schools, and you transitioned to missions, and at the same time, you're launching this ministry from scratch.
Right.
Okay, so I hear the name Seeds of Joy, and I go, it's a wonderful name, but I have no idea what that ministry is about. So tell me what Seeds of Joy is about.
Sowing Seeds of Joy is a ministry. We are mission mobilizers. My wife and I are mission mobilizers. And we felt very strongly about spreading God's word, the seed, and doing it not only in word, but also in deed, but also using that as a platform to educate and equip others about global missions, cross-cultural missions. We found out that many, specifically African-American, and I'm an African-American, many of them are not involved in missions. And the many places that we've gone, to Haiti, Kenya, now and we've gone to Nigeria, Papua New Guinea, all these various places that we have traveled over the years, we've been asked the question, where's the African American? We've been going on trips. When I say we, African Americans do missions. But it's not talked about as much, and it's kind of sporadic, and not many African American churches are truly involved in missions. And we saw that void. I like to say African American missions, MIA, they're missing in action.
So missions mobilization. So is it? So I take it it's a combination of awareness and experience. Well, let me ask you one other question before we get there, and that is, what moved you in the area of missions? Did you take a short-term missions trip at some point, or did you do it on your own initiative, or did you go with someone? What whet your appetite for this?
There were a number of things. One, I tell you, obedience. And my pastor back in Arkansas, when he asked me to take on that endeavor, I was obedient. This was the man of God. This was my pastor. And I just said, this is something I need to do. And at the same time, he said, go learn all you can from one of the largest churches in the area who was doing true missions and work. At that time, they were going to Haiti and sending teams. So we partnered with this particular church, and I began to learn everything they did in terms of going on.
So your first overseas mission trip was to Haiti?
To Haiti.
Okay.
To Haiti.
Which I've never been, but I've heard it's an eye-opener.
It's an eye-opener.
Yeah.
If you can go to Haiti, you can go to anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So the poverty is deep and immense.
The poverty is deep, but the people are real.
Yeah, well, that's true. I find that to be the case. My experience, at least in this part of the world, began with Guatemala, and I found people who were, very, very poor, but tried to manage to go through life as positively as possible, and very open about the things of God.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So Haiti was your first experience, and you said you've been to Kenya. How soon after Haiti did you take a trip to Kenya?
We went to Kenya first. I believe it was around 2004. We met a couple who had been married here in this country. They're Kenyans, and they live here in Dallas. And then we met them in Arkansas, but through a course called Perspective. A gentleman met them and said, "You need to meet this African American couple whose heart is just for missions." And prior to that, I learned that this Kenyan couple had not had many positive encounters with African Americans as far as missions is concerned. And so we met them. We invite this couple over to our home. We had service, worship service at our home. And I knew God was saying there was going to be a relationship here. So it was in 2004. At 2005, thereafter, they went on back to serve their people in Kenya. And it was 2005, we were asked to come and do some workshops in Kenya. And that started the relationship. So we've been going every year.
And how long after the Haitian trip was this?
Well, keep in mind, we've been doing since 1998. We were going to Haiti. Okay. 2 or 3 trips a year to Haiti.
Oh, wow!
And that was since 98, all the way up until 2004. Okay. 2004, and so it was the Haiti trip, and then one trip in between there to South Africa, and then came.
Interesting. So I've been to South Africa as well. That is also a fascinating place.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so obviously you have developed a lot of experience to do what you're doing. So let's say I walk in the door, okay, and I call up Seeds of Joy, or I go on a website. I'm assuming you have a website.
Yes, we do.
It's Seeds of Joy, and I'm curious. Okay, let me have it. What are you going to do with me?
First thing we're going to do is pray. We're going to pray, and then we're going to get to know who you are. One of the things that we take great joy in terms of our ministry is there's this acronym that I've come up with, RISE, R-I-S-E, okay? Relational, intentional, strategic, and evangelistic. The R first, I want to get to know you. One of the questions that people ask all over the world, what do you do? That's the wrong question. Who are you? And so I ask, who are you? I get to know. And then we hear their heart about serving and wanting to do it globally, and why this interest in missions. And then we talk about how we can cultivate that, because one of the things we take very serious about discipling individuals through this process. I tell people it's not important of where we're going. Kenya, Haiti, Papua New Guinea. It's not the destination. It's the journey, And so that's what we would do. We'll sit you down and we would talk and find out why you want to get involved, okay? What do you want to do? Why is God calling you to the mission field? Even if it's short term, because our goal in Seeds of Joy is to whet your appetite so much and encourage you so much that you may even consider going long term. Because the percentage of African Americans involved in long-term missions is very, very, less than 1%.
So, okay, so we sit down and get to know one another. So we've had our coffee, we've done our meal, we've had our conversation. What's next?
Then we determine, looking at the various trips that we have going on, what would be a good fit for you. And then there's the application process of doing that. And then we talk about how that trip is going to unfold. We start a training program in terms of, we have a training program where we start training you from anywhere from 6 months, 8 months, or 6 months out before that trip, because it's short term.
Right.
And short term doesn't have, sometimes it has a bad connotation going on short term. We like to think that we want to do it right. And especially in the African American community, they're not going on short terms at all that much. And so we take great joy and pride, and we like to say we want to do everything with the spirit of excellence. Training is very important, preparing you to go. Recall taking one young lady to Brazil, and she was so excited about going to Brazil. But then about 3 weeks out, she was sitting in one of our meetings. She said, "This is work."
Surprise, surprise.
This is not a vacation.
Yeah.
It's not a vacation. This is God's work, and we're going to do what he has called us to do. And by the way, you're going to find out a whole lot about him and yourself doing the student council.
No, that's true. I mean, I say to people who've never had a cross-cultural experience that, try it. You may or may not like it, but you'll learn a lot about who you are. I mean, it really is a challenge. So your short-term trips, are they 1 week, 2 weeks? How long do they generally last?
It depends on where we're going,
okay.
Of course. We've been going primarily to Kenya, and then we have Cape Town, South Africa. We actually have a ministry called Sowing Seeds of Joy, South Africa. Oh. We have Sowing Seeds of Joy, Kenya.
Now, where do you work in? This fascinates me because I have been involved in Cape Town myself. Where in Cape Town do you minister, or is it various places? Various places.
We took a team several years back to Cape Town, South Africa, in the city in those regions there near Cape Town.
Yeah.
And we worked with a local pastor who was a missions pastor there. He and his wife had spent about 15 years on Mercy Ship, and then they left there, and he became a missions pastor at that church. And we went there, and we went through several communities, showed the Jesus film. We had a wonderful, wonderful experience. And my wife and we came home with our small team, and then we happened to Skype and did a debriefing with this pastor. And he said, "Ron, I really like your story and what you and your wife are doing." And he said, I did not ask for permission, but my wife and I stepped away from our church, and we now have a nonprofit called Sowing Seeds of Joy, South Africa, and you're a star of the founders.
Oh wow! Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been in some of the townships in that part of the world, and have spoken in churches again in the middle of actually one of the more violent parts of Cape Town, and with a ministry that is just absolutely dedicated to serving the people. And in fact, we had the pastor here to tell his testimony, because he has one of the most amazing testimonies I've ever heard in my life, and it's a fascinating but a challenging place to do ministry, because there is so much swirling around many of those communities.
There's one community that they do a lot of work in. It's called Hanover Park. It's gang infested.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so this particular team, his pastor and his wife, they do trauma healing, workshops and healings in that community. And a couple of years back, my wife and I were there, and I was there, and walked with this pastor through those streets, and literally one set of gang was on one side of the street and the other. But I was so impressed with this pastor, he was going from door to door. We were walking the streets, and you can hear voices in the crowd say, "Don't mess with the pastor." So they didn't mess with the pastor, so they respected him.
Yep, that's a very similar story to the community that I ministered in. I mean, in fact, the last time I was in South Africa, and we had actually just spoken at his church, and there had been literally a murder a few houses away from the church that he was having to deal with from a pastoral perspective. It's an incredibly intense ministry.
Yes.
Well, so you're if I can say it this way, you are taking people into some really challenging situations in many cases.
Yes. For example, in Kenya, we do a lot of work on the coastal region of Kenya. just on the Samaria, and we go into areas. That particular area is 98% Muslim, and so we go share the gospel. And we have been in situations where, of course, there were a number of shootings in the area, church bombings. I recall at one particular church, I had to preach directly after there was a bombing not too far from that church. And so, yes, we've gone into a number of places where it's very dangerous, very dangerous.
Wow. Well, so we've had our coffee and you've done the training, and now you've told me about where you're taking me, and I'm really nervous. So what do you hope happens with someone who takes on a short-term experience?
That last word you just said, I want them to truly have an experience with God. I want them to learn and understand that God, He is doing an amazing work all over the world. I like to tell individuals, find out where God is at work and join Him there, okay? And to have an experience. One of the books that we do devotionals on our trips, and one that I've gone back repeatedly to is Experiencing God with Henry Blackaby. And that every time I use that as a devotional on the field, I learn something different every single time. But again, to your question, I really want them to have an experience with God. And I try to tell them, be open to have an experience in the littlest of things. In the littlest of things. I said, do not miss God in the littlest of things.
Interesting. So when you go overseas, I mean, obviously there's ministry, but is it strictly preaching and evangelism, or are other things associated with what you end up doing when you go overseas?
There are other things that are associated with it. One of the things that we take great joy in doing, and it's a non-negotiable, we do not go with our agenda. I tell individuals we're going to serve. And so I ask wherever we're going, I ask our hosts, how can we serve you? And there are times where we've gone and what we have intended to do completely changes. And so we've gone and we've done, we worked in schools, going into schools and to teach. We just took a team to Belize not too long ago. Very easy country to go to, 2 hours flight from Houston, probably one of the most visited locations for short-term teams.
It's true, yep.
And we went there to do one thing, but then we were asked when we got there to do some training and teaching with young students. So it really threw us off of what we were going to do, and that was evangelizing, and door-to-door street evangelism and that sort of thing.
So when you go into a school, what kinds of things do they have you doing there?
Well, let me just talk briefly about Belize.
Okay.
We've gone there and we've ministered in the schools. We've shared the gospel in the schools, but it's also we've gone there and as encouragers. Belize has a situation where there's abuse with the young girls. Real tragic situations in terms of the young girls being abused and taken advantage of and that sort of thing. The young boys, the young men are being ministered to. But we have been told and have experienced the fact that the young girls are not being ministered to. So my wife and I have been taking teams for the past 2 years to go into schools and minister to the young people. Talking of a variety of things of how God wants to use them, but also talking about their own self-worth and how valuable they are.
So on the one hand, you're preaching the word. On the other hand, you're kind of serving in the way that the host community is asking you to serve. Are there any other, this is not best description, but are there any other related kinds of things that you do besides preaching and sharing, besides the local schools? Is there, the short-term work that I'm familiar with, oftentimes people go in and they're building stuff or things like that. Are you doing those kinds of things?
I have done things like that. For example, in Haiti, we added additions. We took a group of men down there and added to a church that needed some additional space. So men like to do things. So, so we gather some men here locally from a small organization, some homeless people too, men, and took them to Haiti to do that addition. We're building wells.
That was my next question.
We got
That's
a well.
My next question.
We had just finished in partnership with a church out of Arkansas and just completed a well in Malindi, Kenya, and then we're looking at a location about 2 hours outside of Mombasa, putting in a well there. So there are a variety.
Why is that important? I mean, most people say, well, so what's the deal there? I mean,
well, the deal there is that I spent 3 months just recently in Kenya, and I journeyed with a pastor friend of mine in Mombasa. He had planted a church 2 hours outside of Mombasa in a very rural area, and he and I journeyed there. It took us 2 hours by car. Bad roads and everything, and I'm looking around. I'm going, where in the world are you taking me? And we finally landed and drove to this location where he had planted a small little church, and out of the woods and everywhere, these people started coming. Women, small children, and I met the elder of the church, and God had blessed him to the point where he gave land so the church can be planted there. And as a result of that one of the church, the government decides to bring a school. To God be the glory. But I asked the elder, what else is needed? Because one of the things I noticed as we sat there for a brief little message, they didn't have any chairs. And these children went in the fields and started bringing out these large boulder rocks. And that's what we sat on in this little small building. All right. So since that time, the church that planted there has been able to get them some chairs. They preferred benches, but they got them some chairs. But I asked, what's the greatest need? He said, we have no water in this area. So they cooked for us. And the water they brought in were carried by hand, buckets over their heads and that sort of thing, 2 miles out. And that broke my heart. You know, no water. You know, not only did that, they had no electricity. They were playing. They worshiped and prayed and did all these things and had this little keyboard, but it was hooked up to a car battery. It's things we don't.
That's right. I haven't seen that. I have to be honest with you. So this is a challenging ministry, but when you do something that seemingly is that simple, it really does change that community, doesn't it?
Oh yes. Matter of fact, the ministry Sowing Seeds of Joy Kenya, their motto is transforming the community through the local church, and it does make an impact. The smallest things make an impact.
So what happened? You build a well, and what happens? I mean, the people now have access to water. They're able to take care of themselves better, et cetera. It just improves the environment of the community. It improves the
environment, improves the community, the whole status in terms of the community, in terms of pride and joy. Not only did the wells, I recall in that community, not too far from that community, well, it's actually in Malindi, near a place called the Sabaki River, we outfitted some like 70 families with water filters because in the Sabaki River, that's where they got their water. And in that river, everything you can probably imagine happened in that river. And the diseases that come from that, the children and that sort of thing. So we went in there and using as a point of entry, because the ultimate thing is to share the word of God. And so we use water filters as a point of contact, a point of entry into sharing the gospel.
Because I imagine the reaction to that is that these people have come from a long way and they really show that they care about us. And then all of a sudden, people's ears are open. And they are really, really ready to listen to what it is that you have to say.
Yes, indeed. And I'm glad you brought that point up because everywhere we've gone, we haven't gone just once. How about twice, 3 or 4 times? Because people, they don't want to, there's the old saying, people don't want to know how much you know. They want to know how much you care.
Exactly.
And it's building relationship.
That's right. Yeah.
It's building relationship. And that's what we take joy in. Remember I said rise, relational. We take a great bit of joy in trying to build and establish relationship.
And so I take it then that just to flip back, your training is designed to help people understand kind of just one, what they may face, but two, kind of the mindset of what you're going in to do? Is that where the training is focused?
Yes. It's focused on really taking God and taking Christ in there and being a great example, and a great witness. It's not so much about the doing; it's about the being, and that's what we take. And so people go, "Well, I'm going to go take Jesus there." First of all, Jesus is already there.
Yeah, that's right.
He's already there. Okay, all right. Yeah. But God may be speaking to you more so than you going to speak to someone else. All right. So the training is. The emphasis is placed on going in there and going in there with the right mindset, okay, and not to mess things up, because there are people who are doing a great work wherever we go, and you just don't want to go in there and mess things up. You want to go in there with a God-like mind, Christ-led, and be willing to learn and be very teachable. I like to say, be fat. Be flexible, attentive, and teachable.
Nice. So I'm fascinated. So where did you learn all this? I mean, because that doesn't just drop in your lap. Where did you develop the sensitivity for, one, for missions, and two, for people, and three, for the cross-cultural experience that says we're going to go in and we're going to serve, and we're going to serve wherever needed, and we think all of that enhances what we do when we want to share the gospel?
Very good question. I like to say is, God has just tagged me to do it. It's been placed in my heart. I didn't ask for this. I thought.
Well, that's been clear from your story.
I didn't ask for this. No, not indeed. My wife did not ask for it. When people see us and they see what we're doing, I recall just recently we had an interest meeting, and the lady that came and said, "You guys are anointed to do this." Whatever that means, again, we're obedient, we're following. But we have a love for it, a passion for it. It's trial and error is one way we've learned things. I mentioned, if I did not mention, I took a course called Perspective, and it's a very, very good discipleship leadership course that focuses on missions. But it will give you an eye opener in terms of what God is doing cross-culturally, globally,
yes,
what he's calling all of us to be about, the Great Commission,
It's a fabulous story. I mean, I just really want to commend you just for, one, the nature of the ministry, and two, the way in which you're going about it. It's my guess is that you've also had probably some pretty good mentors and teaching along the way that have helped to frame the way you view ministry.
Well, I mentioned Dr. Tony Evans.
Yeah, well, that doesn't surprise me.
He's one of his books, Kingdom Agenda.
Sure,
was I highly recommend it. And then there's been other books that I've read. John Piper, Let the Nations Be Glad. A Hole in the Gospel.
Yes.
So a lot of reading that I've done. All right. Going to a lot of seminaries, conferences and such, and just being open to what God is leading us to do. And I say that one term that I've developed is that when I was in Kenya, riding in sort of like a conveyor belt from one floor. It was in a mall. Matter of fact, it was the mall that was shot up by terrorists, and we had just missed that situation. But in that mall, you could take a conveyor belt or some that will take you from one floor to the other. And I stepped on that belt to go to the next floor, and I heard again, God does a lot of speaking in my spirit. He said, "What you're doing, this is what I want. I want you to flow in obedience." And the only way you would get out of that is that you decide to step off. Now, he was talking spiritually to me. Of course, I had to step off and go where I was going. But he said, just flow in obedience. And this has not been the easiest work I've ever done.
No.
This has been tough.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I tell people, working as a police officer, was a lot easier than this.
Interesting. We haven't talked about your wife very much and the role that she plays in this, which is probably when we're running out of time, which is sad. But tell me a little bit about what Star does in the ministry.
Star does everything. Like I said, we've been married 38 years, and even in retrospect, I can see how God has placed us together to do what we're doing today. She is right there by my side. She handles a lot of the logistics, and then she's a praying woman and a godly woman, and so that makes doing this a lot easier. I just told her last week or so, I said, I could not do this without you. And so, yes, she's a strong lady.
Well, this is an amazing story. Tell us a little bit about how, if people want to find out about Seeds of Joy, how they can find out about you.
Well, a couple ways. One, you can go to our website, sowingseedsofjoy.org, and you can even send us a message.
It's all one word, Sowing Seeds of Joy?
All one word, sowingseedsofjoy.org. And, of course, you can go to our website and send us a message by way of that. Also, the mailing address is sowingseedsofjoy.info@gmail.com.
Okay.
So that's one way, and then of course you can give us a call.
Okay. And how often how many trips do you take a year?
We take at least 5 to 7 trips a year.
Oh wow. And those are all overseas. So those
are all overseas.
You're visa busy.
Visa busy. We have been known to take teams. We trained a church in Mississippi, and we took them. They were wanting to take baby steps, if you will. And we took them somewhat in their own neighborhood. We took them to New Orleans. On at least 3 occasions, we took them to New Orleans and partnered with an organization called YWAM.
Well, that's actually cool. I mean, to think about doing this kind of work locally, because most people will jump at the chance to go overseas, but will be slow to do it internally.
Well, one of the things when we train churches, one of the questions we ask them, what are you doing here at home? We don't, to go somewhere else and you're not doing it at home, that's not good. Okay. We even have a workshop called Bloom Where You Planted. And so we talk about it. My experience with Dr. Evans in leading ministries and working as the director of ministries, I was the director of missions and evangelism. So prison ministry I'm familiar with. Street evangelism I'm familiar with. There were about 4 or 5 other ministries that I oversaw. Okay, in addition to missions. But so I can walk into a church and say, what are you doing here at home in your Jerusalem?
That is great. Well, Ron, I mean, it has been just it's been a joy.
I've enjoyed this. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
To hear your story and to hear about your ministry and to see how you are putting together really just a commitment to walk with God, and in the midst of that, grow this ministry that has such terrific sensitivities in terms of how to apply what the Word calls us to do and to be. I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us, and we just trust that the Lord continues to bless your ministry, that you and Star just shine as you minister to people and seek to help these various communities that you get the opportunity to go into. It's a real pleasure.
In Swahili, sawa sawa.
I have no idea what you just said to me, but I'll take it. It's good. Yeah. And we thank you for being a part of the table, and we hope you'll join us again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/the table. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.